Okay, so what is a data set? So when we went into our data catalog yesterday, we basically saw three tabs. The first one was the all tab, and then we have had the tables tab, and then we had the data sets tab, right? Okay, so a data set or data sets. Okay, so now there are different ways to, so ultimately if you have to understand a data set is simply a description of the data that it holds, right? So a data set is a description of the data that it holds, which is basically the metadata. And when I say description, it basically defines in each of the field types what type of data is held. So whether the data that is being held is of type text or integer or date or so on and so forth. So if we have to define a data set,
Is it like a table wherein we have field type where we define
correct.
field
So a
type?
data
Okay.
set is similar to a table, but the
Okay.
difference between a table, a normal transactional table, and a data set is that
Mm-hmm.
you first create a table and then you load data into the table, right? When you do your
Yeah.
transactions, then.
Yeah.
But in data set, a data set is actually created when you load data into Prism, right?
Okay.
So a data set is created using your table. So you don't have to define a data set in advance. It basically based on the data that is getting loaded,
Ah, okay, okay, okay.
automatically the field types workday automatically identifies the field types based on the
Mm.
data in the specific column and creates your
Okay,
data, right? But then
okay.
later we'll see how we can manage our fields using a stage called manage fields. And when I say manage
Yeah,
fields, we change the field types and all that. Uh,
right, right.
Actually, tenant was not working for a long time today. So,
Okay.
so if I have to define a data set is a description. So data set basically shows two things, or this is workday or workday, right? So this description of the data is known as metadata, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we are just talking about
Mhm.
just about data set, right? Not about
Right.
the different type of data sets.
That is also something
So
we'll talk about
whatever.
as we go through base data sets and derived data sets and stuff. We'll talk about that.
Okay.
Okay. Ultimately, they
Okay.
are all the same thing, but any which ways,
Yeah, yeah.
as we
That
go through
yes,
this,
yes. That's what I wanted to ask because see,
mhm,
ultimately the definition of a data set would remain the same, but
remain
maybe
the
the
same,
way
correct?
how we create may be vary.
Or the purpose. No,
Yeah, the
the
purpose.
purpose for which we it defines whether it is a base data set or a derived data set or a published data
Hmm.
set. But
Okay.
we'll talk about that.
Okay.
But all of these, no matter whether you're talking about base data set or derived data set or how that data set was created, this is what a
Right.
data set defines. Okay.
Okay.
So
Okay. Makes sense.
it contains all the data about the data, right? Which is basically the description of the data, the field type, and all the other descriptions, plus a subset of example rows to help understand the data values. Now, a data set may actually have millions of rows of data, right? But when you open a data set, now this is the second difference between a data set and your normal tables, your database tables or your transactional tables. So if you open a transactional table, it will actually show you the number of records in that table, right? It will show you that this table has a million records or 100,000 records or so on and so forth. But a data set, it never shows you either the full number of records. It will not even have the count of number of records that are there in that data set. What you can only see
Okay.
is a small subset of that data, right? So the only
Mm.
way to understand all records in a data set is through visualizations, which is through your reports,
Okay. Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, now there are three types of data sets that we discussed. We'll talk about the published data sets later. So the first one is your base data set. If I also go and show you data, right? So these are the field types in this data set, right? It has all the details of those fields, and then there are some specific fields as well, and we'll talk about these fields.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first data set type is a base data set. Now, a base data set is based on one or more source files. So you can create a base data set by selecting or importing multiple files, right? But then all those files should have the same format, right? Okay, we'll see how data sets can be created from importing the files. The files can either come from an external source or from the output of a Workday custom report. Now, what are the different options for creating a base data set? So a base data set can be created, and we'll look at these options. So the first is you can create a data set by uploading data from a file which exists on your own local machine, right? So you could have some file placed on your local machine, just like we do an inbound EIB, wherein we usually upload or create or run an EIB through an attachment. So in the same context, you can create a base data set by directly uploading a file from your local machine.
Oh, okay.
Okay. But the only difference is, again, and this is something I've told you. So while in an EIB as an example, the EIB
Mhm.
format is predefined, right? And then you're
Correct.
loading. But here, as you load your file, system creates the
It
format of the
creates,
base
it
data set.
creates a format. Okay. So it can be any file, right? For that matter. Maybe if I want to load an applicant data,
Hmm.
maybe I have my applicant data in a different system, but I
Hmm.
want to bring them into Workday and then I want to process or generate the records or visualizations. I can
Hmm.
still do that, correct?
Right, you can do that. So these
Okay.
are the options for doing that. You can do it
Yeah.
from a file. You can do this from SFTP,
Okay.
right? When we do this with an SFTP, you can also actually build an integration, right? and you can schedule that integration
Oh,
so that Workday automatically fetches that file based on the integration that you have scheduled. Okay, so this
so
basically, mhm,
when you say the SFTP, so are we saying we are going to create,
mhm.
a studio or something which
No,
actually
not required.
extracts the data?
Not required. Not required. We'll talk about that, right?
Okay.
You don't have to do
Okay.
that. It's a simple. Okay, have you created an outbound EIB or inbound EIB?
Yeah, inbound we have done.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
both we have done. Sorry.
right.
Yeah,
So
both we have done.
if for example you talk about an outbound EIB, right? If you see there are different options
Mm,
when it comes to delivering
correct.
data
Get
section,
data.
Workday
Yeah, yeah,
attachment or
yeah.
SFTP, right?
SFTP.
Exactly same concept.
Correct.
So you don't have to create a
Correct.
studio for that, right? You just simply specify the
Okay.
details. Give me a second.
So, okay. Maybe we will do that. Yeah.
Okay, so it creates data from an external uh, that Workday retrieves from a SFTP server using integration. So these are both. So the first two options are basically for your external data. So if you're talking about file or so again, this creates data or this creates a data set with your external data. So the first two options, they basically create a data set using your external data. Now we have also mentioned that your base data sets can also be created from your workday data, right? And what is the option for that? The option is simply custom report,
Custom report.
right? So this option creates a data or data set with workday data. All right. Okay. So the
Okay,
second.
maybe. So, sorry to interrupt. Out of curiosity,
Mhm,
I'm asking.
mhm,
So,
mhm,
while I was creating the custom report, there is an option in the output tab or somewhere. Somewhere I saw Prism enabled.
mhm.
Is
Yeah.
that relevant here?
Yes. Relevant here. When we create our
Okay.
custom report, we'll talk about that.
Okay. Okay. Sure. Sorry, I just jumped in because
Oh
I
no,
just
this is
want to
all
get.
right. You just make my work a bit easy. So that is all right.
Okay.
Okay. So that is base data set, and then we have derived data set. Okay. Now a derived data set, as the name suggests, a derived data set is actually derived either from an existing base data set or an existing derived data set or existing tables, right? So your derived data sets, it actually imports data from an existing data set or from an existing table, right? So those
Existing?
data table,
What was the
table,
second table? Okay.
table,
Okay.
right? So as I mentioned, if you see, we have two options. One is data sets, and then we have
Yeah.
tables,
Okay. Okay.
right?
Yeah. 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 Right.
Almost
Right.
same concept. We'll talk about tables later. It's just a minor difference, but almost everything is same. So that's why I'm just talking about data set right now,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
So a derived data set is based on one or more existing tables or data sets. So you can create a derived data set, let's say
Okay.
DD1, and this data set could be based on one or more base data sets, plus
Okay.
it can also include one or more derived data sets. It can also include one or more tables. So a derived data set is either based on existing data sets or tables. Okay. and we'll see how that is done.
Mm.
Now, what
Yeah.
is the purpose of these derived data sets? Why would you create derived data sets? So the purpose of base data sets is to import data, right? You
To
create base.
transform, right?
Yes. So while base data sets are created to import data, your derived data sets are basically created if you want to transform the data.
Transform.
Use
But
so
how will we
why
decide whether this requires a, sorry, how we will decide whether this requires a transformation or not?
so basically your data is in some format. Let's say you want to club data some from workday source and non-workday source. So you have created
Ah,
two data sets now. One has your
right.
workday data, one has non-workday data. Now, how will you club it? You'll
Mm.
have to create a derived data set wherein you'll import both of this
Okay.
data and then transform it. Right? Just
Okay.
one example, but
Okay.
there would be multiple ways.
There could be many. Yeah.
Right? So you use
Yeah,
derived
sure.
data set to basically blend together data from
Mm-hmm.
different sources and transform it, right? When I say transform, you can basically modify fields, you can join, you can merge data, you can create calculated fields based on your requirement, and so on and so forth,
Yeah.
right? Okay, some transformation stages, and we'll talk about these transformation stages in detail later. Some stages are
Yeah.
only available for derived data sets, some stages are available for base data sets. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
okay, in which ways? That is something we'll talk about in detail later. Okay, let me show you a data set workspace and how does it look. So till now, we have been looking at the data catalog. Now, if you go to a data catalog and select a data set and then right click on the data set, you have this view option. So let's view in. So there are different options and we'll talk. So this is the option, if you remember, I spoke about with respect to manage, right? So if you remember,
Right.
yesterday we spoke about manage and owner manage.
And
So
on.
while,
Correct.
right, so manage gives you the option to edit, owner manage
Edit
gives
and
you the
share.
option, right,
Share.
share
Share.
as well.
Yeah.
So right now I have both these options. I have the option to edit as well as share. Okay.
Right.
But for now, I
Right.
am going to view this in a new tab. Okay, so we'll talk about these type. If you see there's something called an integration mode and it says append, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it says it is a description of some sample data which has been created from a custom report. It shows me how this data set has been created. So this is actually a
Oh.
data set that I'm knowing. It shows me the data source was created from a workday report. It shows me whether any
Mm-hmm.
security has been applied to it. It shows me the status of the data set, whether it is published or not published, and a host of other information. So when was it created, who created it, the last time it was modified, and who modified, and so on and so forth. Now, every data set, as I mentioned, is a description of the data, right? It's a data on the data.
Yeah.
So these are the different field
Mm.
types. And when I click on those field types, it gives me the details of those field types. It will also show me some statistics. Now, what are these statistics? It basically shows me statistics like which value has the maximum recurrence, what is the median of the values present, and so on and so forth. So for each field, it
Oh.
shows me statistics. It shows me the field type. Now this is numeric with 10 digits before and 4 digits after. There are two other fields and we'll talk about these fields later. Now, as I mentioned, a data set never shows you the full list of data. It only shows you a sample data. So here, the sample, and that is something we can change. So if you see the maximum data I can see is up to 20 rows of sample data, right? So I cannot see more than 10, 20k rows of data. Okay, the next thing,
Mm.
right now I'm in this icon. If I click here, this is where it will show me that sample data as well. So right now it is showing me
Oh,
sample of 100 rows, but if I want, I can select up to a maximum of 20k rows.
I just had a weird question there. So
Mhm,
let's say, I mean, uh, do we get the file in a specific format, like it should have headers or it
mhm.
should, so, I mean, is it any
Yeah,
mandatory to have in a file what we get? Do
that
we
is
expect
something.
some mandatory?
Okay, so that is all you can configure with respect to parsing. So now let me talk about that. So when I click, so this is my view mode of a data source, right? Now when I click on edit, this is what takes me to the data set workspace, right? Here I
Mhm.
define those parsing options. Now a data set, and we'll talk about this, a data set consists of a pipeline, and it
Mm-hmm.
consists of a number of stages. We'll talk about these stages. As I mentioned, only some stages can be created in base data sets, whereas if you look
Mm-hmm.
at a derived data set, it would have a lot of other stages. So let me show you this data set as an example. Again, these stages, we'll talk about them in detail later. For now, I'm just showing you a comparison between a base data set and a derived data set. The data set
So
is. Mhm.
the other question, how will you know whether that is a derived data set or a base data set?
Okay, Workday itself doesn't give you any description. So if you see, this report is also called
Yeah,
view data set. This is also
correct,
called view
correct,
data set. So one way to know it,
correct.
so the standard naming convention that is used is, for base data set you use BDS, and for derived data set you use DDS. There's one more thing, when you click on
Oh,
edit, right? As I mentioned, the
mm-hmm.
stages that are available depends on the
Stages
data
will
set
be
type.
mine.
So here,
Okay.
if I click on add stage, if you see, the stages that are available are filter, group by,
Right,
join, and so on and so forth. Here I have
right.
just a few stages,
Okay, okay.
right? Okay, so
Yeah.
this is my pipeline. We'll talk about this. System shows you the primary pipeline, but there could be many pipelines. Now, what is a pipeline? We'll talk about that later. So right now it is showing me data from this pipeline. Now, as I mentioned, a derived data set is nothing but it may consist of multiple base data sets, multiple tables, right? So each base data set or each derived data set or each table which is flowing into this data set creates a pipeline. So right now, everything is being showed from this pipeline. If I click on change pipeline, it will show me other pipelines as well. So if you see, this data set
Mhm.
actually has two pipelines. That means it is importing data from two different sources. They could be base data sets, they could be tables, they could be derived data sets. But looking at the description, I know this is some data set called BDS, base data set all employees, and then it is also importing data from another data set which is BDS call center. Now this data set has only one stage. So this is my additional pipeline, if you see, and if I go back and select this is my primary
Acha,
pipeline.
acha.
Okay, so I
Okay,
can
okay,
see
okay,
all
okay.
pipelines here. Okay, so this is my sample
Mm,
data. Again, I would see the sample data here, right? Now when I click on any field, again it opens up the
mm,
inspector section or the inspector uh,
mm.
column. Now
Okay.
here, if you see, it shows me those metrics,
Mm.
right? It shows that 72% of the values are global support area,
Right.
25% are this. It shows me the field type.
Mm-hmm.
Again, if I click here, it shows me that 65%. Now all metrics are being shown based on the sample data that is displayed. So it is not showing me metrics on the full volume of data
Okay.
that is available
So,
in that data. Mhm. You
so
hear
the
me? Sorry.
question I had was like there's something called sample 1K rows, right? So do we have other filters as well?
Yeah. So this is what I
Hello?
showed you earlier as well, right? here these are the options available. So these are the options. This is what I showed earlier
Yes,
as
yes,
well, right?
yes, Ravi. Yeah.
Maximum you can show a sample of 20k rows, but your
Okay.
data sets could have hundreds and thousands of
20K.
probably millions of records, right? But then this
Okay.
is the
Yeah.
maximum sample. Now the moment I
Mm-hmm.
change the sample, data set would also show or refresh these visualizations, right?
Okay.
So it is always showing me
Okay. Great.
metrics based on what
Mhm.
sample I have selected. So now it seems it is changed, right? Now it shows 65 and 34. Earlier, I think it was 62 and 27 or something. All right. Okay. So this is my hello. Are you there?
Yeah, yeah. I'm
Oh,
there. I'm on mute because a lot of noise. So.
okay, sure. This is where I can add my Prism calculated fields, right? If you see, it shows me all the fields. So there are 12 fields in the system, and there is one calculated field that has been created. I can click on it and it takes me to that calculated field. So for everywhere else, if you see, it just shows me the field details. The moment I click on a calculated field, it shows me the field info, the calculation that was created, but it also shows me a function library. So this is where I have all the calculations available. These are all the calculations that can be built. Okay. So for a field, it shows me the field info, right? The top n values, those metrics, but it also shows me the function library if the field is a calculated field. And if you see, this is where it also again shows me the calculation for that field. So this is where it shows me all the fields, right? If I want, I can search for a field, or if I click here, it will take me back to the description that we had seen earlier. If you see, this is what it shows me, the description,
Okay.
right? So this is my data set workspace. Sorry, yeah, data set workspace. So data set work. So the idea is, if you go to any data set and click on edit, this is what takes you to the data sets workspace. So the edit data set task takes you to the data set workspace, wherein data set can be manipulated. Okay, again, there are different options to edit a data source, a data set. Either I can directly click on a data set or click on edit from here. If you see, I have the option to edit, or I can view the data set, and on the view mode, I can edit the data set.
Okay.
Right? So, or I can go to this view data set, and here as well, I have the edit option. Okay. Uh, all right. Now, what are the different aspects? So the first thing that you see in the edit mode is the pipeline list, right? This shows all pipelines which flow into the data set. One thing to again remember, that your base data set would only have one pipeline, whereas your derived data set may have multiple pipelines,
Okay.
right? Okay, the second thing, when you click on a pipeline within within a given pipeline, you can view all these stages. So when you click on a pipeline, you can view all the stages. Now we'll talk about some of these stages in detail later. So for base data set, parse stage is the first stage, and for derived data set, let me show you. So again, this is my base data set. If you see, the first stage is the parse stage, and for a derived data set, the first stage is always the import stage, right? Now what are these stages?
Okay.
What is the difference between parse and import? Once we create our data set, we'll have a look. So for
Yeah.
derived, so again, another way by which you can understand whether a data set is a base data set or a derived data set. So for a derived data set, import stage is always the first stage, right? Second thing is inspector panel, right? So clicking on any field will open up the inspector panel, right? And this inspector panel basically has two things. One is the field info, and then we have the functions library, right? And then there are a host of other things. For example, as I mentioned, the Prism calculated field expression bar, the state statistics, and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's talk about the data sets pipeline. Or Sai, I'll have to close now. I actually thought we'll connect at 4:30.